All right, welcome back to our YouTube channel where we talk about Java for absolute beginners. So, on today's edition of the course, we are going to be talking about loops in Java, right? So, what are loops in Java? Loops in Java is a way to write a particular block of code when a particular condition is true, right? So you want a particular block of code to keep running as long as a particular condition is true, and that particular block of code is expected to stop running when the condition is false, right? So let me give you the we have different types of loops in Java. We have the while loop, we have the do while loop, we have the for loop, we have the for each loop, right? And all of these loops, even though they do different things, they have they are they are they have different their differences, right? They have what differentiates them from one another, right? And in this video I'll be talking about these different types of loops and what differentiate them. Let's dive right into it. So the first one I'll be talking about the first one I'll be talking about is the while loop, right? So the while loop is basically used to run a particular condition or run a particular block of code when the condition is true, right? So and the syntax for the while loop is while bracket open and close, curly braces open and close, right? So inside the bracket open and close, that's where we have the condition. So we expected this condition to be true for we expected the condition to be true for the code inside the curly braces to run. So let's say I'm printing hello world to the console, right? And for me to print this hello world to the console, I need to have a condition that is true, right? So let's declare two variables and value equal to 10 and count equal to 0, right? So if you say count while count is less than value, print hello world, right? While count is less than value, print hello world. You can see that from the two variables, count is less than value, which is true, right? So if we run this code now, we'll see that hello world will be printed. But for us not to have an infinite, because if you run this code like this, count would always be less than value, right? And because of that we'll have an infinite loop, right? So what we would need to do is to update the value of count every time we run the code inside the while loop, right? So we can do this count plus plus, right? This count plus plus is just basically adding one to count every single time, right? So if we run this code, you see that we'll be able to print hello world for a particular number of time, right? 10 times we're going to print hello world 10 times, and then at the 10th time we will not be able to print hello world because count is not less than value, right? So this is okay. So let me add count. Yes, so we are able to print hello world 10 times, right? If you count the number of times that we have, you see that it's 10. So at every point in time, the value of count is updated, right? So you can see that when count got to 10, right, this condition here is false. So the value 10 is not printed, right? We stopped at 9, right? So that is what the while loop looks like, right? So we also have what we call the do while loop, right? We have the do while loop. Let me okay, the do while loop, do while loop, right? So the do while loop is um, also similar to the while loop, right? The do while loop also works as a way to look run a particular code based on certain conditions, continuously run a particular code based on certain conditions. That's true, right? But in the case of the do while loop, right, the the first the first the code is run before we start checking out the condition, right? So let's assume that we have let's assume that we have value as 0 and count is equal to 0, right? You should see that count is not less than value, because count is 0 and value is 0, right? But if you run this code, you see that because it's a do while loop, right, the code will be run first before checking out for the condition. So let me bring this out so you can see. Yes, this is the do while loop. The do while loop, we're able to print out hello world plus 0 even when count is less than even when count is not less than value, right? So if we bring this back to the while loop, to the usual while loop, right? If we bring this back to the usual while loop, you notice that we will not get count hello world plus count printed, because with the while loop the condition is first checked to ensure that it's true, and if you check this condition, count is not less than value, this is false, this is a false statement, right? So because of that, count will not be printed, right? So that's the difference between the while loop and the do while loop, right? So let's go back to what we were doing. So like I said, the do while loop also works like the while loop. You see that we also have the same. Oh, okay. Um, okay. So you can see that we so because I didn't add count plus plus, we are getting an infinite loop, and it was almost maxing out the system, right? Which is not supposed to be. We are not supposed to. We always should not implement an infinite loop inside an infinite and a code to run infinitely inside the loop. That's not um, a good approach, right? That's why we try to increment the value so that at some point the condition will be false, right? So that is that for the do while loop. So let's talk about the for loops. So we have what we call the for loops. So the for loop is also another way of looping, um, writing or implementing a particular code, or running a particular code based on certain conditions, right? So but for the case of the for loop, we don't use the while keyword, we use the for keyword, for, right? Bracket open and close, then we declare the variable, right? So we are declaring the variable and we are calling the variable I, right? So we say I less than value, right? Then we say I plus plus. So if you check this inside the brackets, you see that we are declaring I, which is what we had there for int count, right? We are declaring I to be 0. Then we are saying I is less than value. which is also the same as what we had here, which is also the same as what we had here, right? Then we're also saying I plus plus, which is what we had here as well, right? So the approach is always is still the same, right? Just that the syntax is different, right? So if we say if we print out hello world, if we print out hello world plus count, you should see we have, yes, you should see we still got the same result, right? We still got the same results because this also works the same as the while loop, right? It's the same the while loop, right? So that is the for loop, right? So in the for loop we have what we call nested for loops. So nested for loops is a way to print to is like having a for loop inside another for loop, right? So as we have this for loop now, we can see we can have another for loop, right? And say in g equal to 0, g less than 3, g plus plus, right? So this is what we call in the nested for loop, right? So even though this is not good, it's not a good practice to have multiple nested for loops, because you can have as many nested for loops as you want, but it's not a good practice, right? This will increase the time complexity of running this code and affect your system CPU, right? So this is not advised, right? But there are for the for the purpose of this course, right, you're going to touch it so that you understand that it exists, right? So in for this now, if you print hello world plus I plus I plus G, you see what happens. Yes, so you notice that hello world plus I plus J. So from the console, you notice that for every value of I, we are going to loop through J this number of times, right? For every value of I, we are going to loop through J this number of times. So if we have 10 here, right, for every value of I, we are going to loop through J 10 times. So when I is 0, we will loop through J 3 times. When I is 1, we will loop through J 3 times, and when I is 2, we look through J 3 times. So that's what we have here, right? So that's why I said it's not a good approach, because would this should imagine we have the value is equal to like 1000, and what we have inside of this J is like 2000. So that means from this value of 0 to the 1000 value, we will have to be looping through J this nth time, right? So which is not a good practice, right? Like I said, this would increase your system time complexity of running this code, right? So it's not advisable to do this, right? So that is that for loops. So let's talk about the for each loop. Let's talk about the for each loop. So the for each loop is basically used to integrate through arrays, right? So let's say you have an array and you want to get every item in the array, right? You can use the for each loop. You can also use the for loop, right? But it's before each loop is better to is better for this purpose, right? So let me give you an instance of how we can use for loop to loop through an array, and how we can use for each loop to loop through an array as well, right? So let me declare an array of um, names of cars, right? So names of cars equal to BMW, Benz, Ford, Toyota, Rolls Royce, Bentley, right? So these are names of cars, and this is an array, right? This is how an array looks like, right? So using the for loop, right, we can see for int I equal to 0, I less than names of cars dot length, right, 5 plus plus, right? So if we print the value, if we want to print the values of cars, we'll see names of cars, brackets open and close, right, I. So this will print each item in this array. So let's run it and see. Yes, so you can see that um, we're able to print BMW, Benz, Ford, Toyota, Rolls Royce, Bentley, right? So